Thanks for coming. I hope this is a useful webinar for some of you. I'm having the same problem as I had last time, where as soon as I put the slides up, I can't see myself. And when I looked back last time, I had a few embarrassing extreme close-ups. So I'm going to try and avoid that. But apologies if I go off screen slightly. But today I want to talk about using nutrition to improve mental health, or specifically for those of us in the creative industries, getting through a tough period as a performer or someone who works in the arts. A little quick rundown. I went through this last time. I'm a nutritionist and also an opera singer. I did my initial studies at the Australian Institute of Fitness. Then I came to the UK to do a master's in music at the Guildhall, went on and had a career at places like Glyndebourne, the English National Opera, and then more recently at places like the Metropolitan Opera and the Royal Opera House. And this was while doing postgraduate studies in nutritional science at Deakin University in Melbourne. And I work in a private practice that I own and run, duncanrocknutrition.com. And I also work at the Voice Care Centre in London, working specifically with singers and professional voice actors and professional voice users, and using nutrition to improve their vocal health. So why nutrition in this context? Well, as I've sort of outlined already, in a period of time where mental health is likely to suffer, our diet can either be a useful tool to help us get through this difficult period, or it can be a mechanism through which we further exacerbate mental health issues. So in that sense, it can really be a double-edged sword. It can either be used to your benefit, or it can be used to your detriment. Also, in my professional experience, it tends to be an area that is often both overlooked and undervalued. There seems to be a general reluctance in many individuals to accept the research in this area. And I think this might be down to several reasons. Firstly, it does seem to be, on the surface, potentially too simplistic. Obviously, something like depression or any mental health issues are very, very complex, multifaceted illnesses. And I think the suggestion that one's diet may have a positive impact on that, it just seems a little bit too easy in some respects. Also, it sometimes can seem too far removed. But I think it's very easy to disprove this. We know conclusively that our physical health and our mental health are inextricably linked. And of course, our diet has a massive impact on our physical health. So it's really only one step removed from something that's generally very well accepted. So your diet will likely have an impact on your physical health, which will likely have an impact on your mental health. Also, we do have this cultural experience where many people seem to want, or we're programmed to want, an answer in what I would describe as a pill or a toxin form. So we are programmed to want to take that magical thing that will help our problems, or particularly in the context of nutrition, people like to talk about that magical toxin. What is that thing that I'm consuming that's causing all my issues? Is it lactose? Is it gluten? Is it trans fats? So we have this culturally ingrained desire to want that magical solution. And then finally, what you'll recognize by the end of this lecture, of this webinar, is that the dietary recommendation that is likely to yield benefit to you is actually quite simple. And this should be welcome news, but I think the simplicity of it makes many people reluctant to accept its efficacy. And I will admit, I experienced this myself. when I first started studying nutritional science and started to read the research regarding the effect of diet on mental health, I was very, very skeptical. But once I'd read research and had some clinical experience, I realized that actually the link is quite strong. So in some respects, I have two goals today. The first is to give some practical advice that you can use in your life. And the second, in a way, is to convince you that a dietary intervention may have some real serious efficacy in the treatment of some mental health issues. Firstly, and very importantly, the advice I'm going to give you today is to be used as a tool alongside any current mental health care that you are involved in. So nothing I'm saying today is intended to be a replacement for any treatment, whether that be pharmacological or therapeutic or otherwise, that you are currently undergoing. It is simply a tool that I'm offering you or inviting you to try or use that may help alongside those things. And it's really important for me to emphasize that. Today, I want to focus most on diet and depression. And we often talk about this being an inexact but undeniable link. Now, depression is an increasingly prevalent disease in our society, or some people don't like to refer to it as a disease. I respect that. Depression is increasingly prevalent in society. And in fact, it's expected to become the second most
limited spaces, and there is a fee. But if you would be interested in being involved in that, then please email us, connect@Collective Creative Initiative. Initiative.co.uk, and we'll add you to our mailing list, and we will know more to next, and so on and so forth. So it's a really good thing to be doing. Also coming up in November, we are going live, CCI Live. I know, hopefully, we'll see what happens, with the rule of 6, or is it 15? I think it's 30. No, it's 6. Who knows? Anyway, when that happens, and we can get confirmation on the 15th, 16th, 14th, 15th of November, we will be live on that weekend. Yes, we are bringing practitioners live into the room. Very limited spaces, and there is a fee. But if you would be interested in being involved in that, then please email us, connect@collectivecreativeinitiative.co.uk, and we'll add you to our mailing list, and we will know more probably 24 hours before. No, I'm just being sarcastic. Anyway, let's bring Duncan in. Enough of my politics. How you doing, Duncan? You all right?
Hey, good to see you, James. How are you?
All I know is that that's what I know on a daily basis these days. I don't know how it is. But how are things with you? Where are you in the world?
I am at my house in the south of England. I live in Brighton Hove area. And
really? We're in Sussex.
Yeah, and it's beautiful down here. I moved here from London about 3 years ago because I kind of got old and a bit boring and wanted to start a family. So we're doing that. I have a 3-month-old daughter, and I'm just
Oh,
and raising her at the moment.
we're in Haywards Heath, so we'll have to meet up for a beer when we can. So
I would love it. I would love that.
very close to you. Tell us a little bit about today's session, and then I will love and leave you.
Great. Well, obviously, a lot of us in the creative industries are having a very difficult period at the moment. As some of you may know, I'm a nutritionist, but also I have an international career as a baritone, as an opera singer. And I, like many people, have had a year's worth of work cancelled already. I just found out last week the Metropolitan Opera in New York has cancelled their entire season, and I had a major contract there in March. And so, it's a period of time when mental health is likely to suffer. So I wanted to give a little talk and give some advice about how one can use nutrition or dietary interventions to help with that.
Definitely. Fantastic. Well, look, that sounds amazing. We're going to do some screen sharing, so just shout when you need that. I'm going to love and leave you, and have a fantastic session.
Thank you. Well, I'll put up these slides now, and if you would mind screen sharing, that would be great, James.
Awesome. Brilliant stuff. I'll see you in about an hour.
Too easy. Thank you. All right. So thanks for coming. I hope this is a useful webinar for some of you. I'm having the same problem as I had last time, where as soon as I put the slides up, I can't see myself. And when I looked back last time, I had a few embarrassing extreme close-ups. So I'm going to try and avoid that. But apologies if I go off screen slightly. But today I want to talk about using nutrition to improve mental health, or specifically for those of us in the creative industries, getting through a tough period as a performer or someone who works in the arts. A little quick rundown. I went through this last time. I'm a nutritionist and also an opera singer. I did my initial studies at the Australian Institute of Fitness. Then I came to the UK to do a master's in music at the Guildhall, went on and had a career at places like Glyndebourne, the English National Opera, and then more recently at places like the Metropolitan Opera and the Royal Opera House. And this was while doing postgraduate studies in nutritional science at Deakin University in Melbourne. And I work in a private practice that I own and run, duncanrocknutrition.com. And I also work at the Voice Care Centre in London, working specifically with singers and professional voice actors and professional voice users, and using nutrition to improve their vocal health. So why nutrition in this context? Well, as I've sort of outlined already, in a period of time where mental health is likely to suffer, our diet can either be a useful tool to help us get through this difficult period, or it can be a mechanism through which we further exacerbate mental health issues. So in that sense, it can really be a double-edged sword. It can either be used to your benefit, or it can be used to your detriment. Also, in my professional experience, it tends to be an area that is often both overlooked and undervalued. There seems to be a general reluctance in many individuals to accept the research in this area. And I think this might be down to several reasons. Firstly, it does seem to be, on the surface, potentially too simplistic. Obviously, something like depression or any mental health issues are very, very complex, multifaceted illnesses. And I think the suggestion that one's diet may have a positive impact on that, it just seems a little bit too easy in some respects. Also, it sometimes can seem too far removed. But I think it's very easy to disprove this. We know conclusively that our physical health and our mental health are inextricably linked. And of course, our diet has a massive impact on our physical health. So it's really only one step removed from something that's generally very well accepted. So your diet will likely have an impact on your physical health, which will likely have an impact on your mental health. Also, we do have this cultural experience where many people seem to want, we're programmed to want an answer in what I would describe as a pill or a toxin form. So we are programmed to want to take that magical thing that will help our problems, or particularly in the context of nutrition, people like to talk about that magical toxin. What is that thing that I'm consuming that's causing all my issues? Is it lactose? Is it gluten? Is it trans fats? So we have this culturally ingrained desire to want that magical solution. And then finally, what you'll recognize by the end of this lecture, of this webinar, is that the dietary recommendation that is likely to yield benefit to you is actually quite simple. And this should be welcome news, but I think the simplicity of it makes many people reluctant to accept its efficacy. And I will admit, I experienced this myself. When I first started studying nutritional science and started to read the research regarding the effect of diet on mental health, I was very, very skeptical. But once I'd read research and had some clinical experience, I realized that actually the link is quite strong. So in some respects, I have two goals today. The first is to give some practical advice that you can use in your life. And the second, in a way, is to convince you that a dietary intervention may have some real serious efficacy in the treatment of some mental health issues. Firstly, and very importantly, the advice I'm going to give you today is to be used as a tool alongside any current mental health care that you are involved in. So nothing I'm saying today is intended to be a replacement for any treatment, whether that be pharmacological or therapeutic or otherwise, that you are currently undergoing. It is simply a tool that I'm offering you or inviting you to try or use that may help alongside those things. And it's really important for me to emphasize that. Today, I want to focus most on diet and depression. And we often talk about this being an inexact but undeniable link. Now, depression is an increasingly prevalent disease in our society, or some people don't like to refer to it as a disease. I respect that. Depression is increasingly prevalent in society. And in fact, it's expected to become the second most impactful disease within the next 5 years, the first being cardiovascular disease. And that basically means all the negative consequences that flow from that condition. It will be the second most impactful in its totality. It can also be extremely debilitating, with sufferers reporting poorer quality of life, reduced social functioning, and decreased work performance. So you can see on the right there, I've provided this illustration of by the fantastic graphic artist Sylvie. He did a wonderful series of illustrative depictions of various mental health issues, and that's his depiction of depression, which is, I think, quite accurate. It really can be the most extraordinarily debilitating experience to suffer from depression. It's also multifaceted, so it cannot be often not normally solved by any sort of simple intervention. So I emphasize again that the dietary advice I would give you is simply one tool that you can use in treatment of these symptoms. It's not, I'm not intending to suggest that change your diet and everything will be fixed. However, there is some very strong evidence that dietary choices can have an impact, whether that be positive or negative, on depressive symptoms in many individuals. It won't necessarily cure an illness, but it is likely to reduce both the severity and duration of symptoms, and potentially even prevent the onset of new symptoms. So it can be a very powerful tool that you can utilize in your ongoing mental health care. If you need to be convinced, like I did, there was a very major review just this year in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. And it was a review of 20 studies, a review paper, for those of you who aren't necessarily studied in scientific research. A review is basically a study of studies. So this paper took 20 studies on the topic of diet and depression, and found from all of that collated evidence put together that the following advice: avoiding processed foods, consuming an anti-inflammatory diet, and the consumption of fish and other healthy fats, things like avocados and olive oil and so forth, we're going to get into that, was inversely correlated to the onset of depression and depressive symptoms. So the more of these people tended to consume in their diets, the less severe and the less lengthy depressive symptoms tended to be. So that was a major review that came out just recently, earlier this year. There are plenty of other studies that show similarly. I've picked this one as another example, but it basically showed that consumption of a diet high in fresh fruit and leafy green vegetables has been shown to have a favorable effect on depressive symptoms in as early as adolescence. So it's not necessarily just useful in adult subjects, but it can be useful in younger people too. Teenagers are also suffering from higher levels of depression than in previous generations. And the general finding in that study was that high intakes of healthy foods, things like whole grains, vegetables, and low-fat dairy, were associated with lower levels of depression, and high intakes of unhealthy foods, predominantly things like processed foods or high sugar foods, were associated with higher levels of depression. So it's very clear research showing the value of this. The good news is the diet one needs to adhere to or take on to see some sort of benefit need not be too restrictive or too onerous. And in fact, there is research that suggests the opposite. In fact, that more onerous or restrictive diets were linked with increased prevalence of depressive symptoms in some individuals. So a particularly restrictive diet, whether it be eliminating entire food groups or particularly calorie restrictive or eliminating an entire macronutrient, carbohydrates, for example, were also related to increased depressive symptoms. So the reason for this was hypothesized that following a diet that is particularly restrictive or particularly onerous starts to fall onto the spectrum of what we call disordered eating. Now, disordered eating is not going to be the focus of today, but anything that's far too onerous or restrictive may start to fall onto that spectrum. So what you'll learn by the end of this webinar, what you'll understand by the end of this webinar, is that the healthy, balanced approach is optimal in this regard. So which diet should I follow, or which dietary pattern should I follow? I apologize for that noise. My neighbors are having a fantastic extension built into their garden, and it's taken quite a while, and it's quite noisy, so I apologize for that. The diet benefits have been seen in this regard in many common dietary patterns. And in fact, reductions in depressive symptoms and the onset of depression have been seen in clinical research studies with the Mediterranean diet, the whole foods diet, the French diet, and the Japanese diet. So I'm just going to quickly outline these diets, and then we're going to look for some common threads between them to see which underpinning values we might be able to adopt in the treatment of depressive symptoms. So the Mediterranean diet is the most studied diet in this context. And we have evidence from all kinds of trials to show this: randomized control trials, cross-sectional trials, and longitudinal studies. So it's really very well studied. Now, the Mediterranean diet is characterized by regular and liberal consumption of olive oil, significant intake of plant foods, things like vegetables, grains, fruits, legumes, and nuts, a moderate consumption of fish and other seafood and dairy, a low to moderate alcohol intake, which is what most people like about this, the predominantly red wine, and comparatively low intake of red and other meat products. So, and finally, most importantly, it also is characterized by little to no intake of processed or refined foods. And you can see here just a graphic representation of the Mediterranean diet food pyramid. Tons of vegetables and whole grains down the bottom, moving up to some fish and seafood. Above that, things like other animal-based products, poultry, eggs, cheese, and yogurt, and then very less often things like red meat and sweets. And then you see to the side there, moderate consumption of red wine. The whole foods diet has also been shown to have some efficacy in treating depressive symptoms. This is characterized by, basically, it's quite simple. It's characterized by a diet that's contains minimally processed foods and tends to be very low in refined and processed sugars. Now, this is not to be confused with a whole foods plant-based diet. And people tend to be a little bit confused or get those two mixed up. A whole foods plant-based diet will be a whole foods diet, but it also limits or restricts any sort of animal products. Whereas the studies I'm talking about talk about a whole foods diet that does contain animal products, but in a non-processed form. So it allows things like a chicken breast, not a chicken sausage, a pork loin, not bacon or ham, things like that. The French diet, which is characterized by a high intake of vegetables and legumes, often sauteed, once again, grains and whole grains, full-fat dairy, and low to moderate amounts of meat and fish, and then once again, a moderate consumption of red wine. And then finally, the Japanese diet, which is once again minimally processed, seasonal foods served in a variety of small dishes, rich in things like steamed rice, noodles, fish, tofu, natto, seaweed. Natto, for those of you who don't know, is a sort of soybean-based dish. Seaweed and fresh cooked or pickled fruits and vegetables. Once again, low in added sugars and fats. So, what are the common threads here that we might be able to take away from some of this research? Or, what would I recommend you do? Now, the fundamental thing here, and I touched on this already, is that you need not overhaul your entire diet to see benefit. And I would recommend these sort of 3 simple steps and, a little bonus attached, which is a diet beneficial in treating depressive symptoms is characterized by, firstly, high intake of fruits and vegetables. So, and particularly fresh fruits and vegetables. All the green leafy vegetables, spinach, broccoli, cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, kale, romaine lettuce, all these things, fruits, bananas, apples, all of that good stuff. Now, importantly and practically, things like frozen vegetables and fruits, or even canned vegetables and fruits, are also useful in this regard. I think marketing has convinced us to sort of think that, oh, unless you're getting your vegetables from, an overpriced wholesaler or something, an overpriced farmer's market, they don't have any value. It's simply not true. And there's plenty to be gained from more practical ways of consuming consuming fruits and vegetables. Number two, high intake of whole grains, things like brown rice, oats, quinoa, all that kind of stuff is also a really good advice in this context, in the treatment of depressive symptoms. Thirdly, the diet should be low in refined and processed foods. Now, it doesn't have to be completely free of refined and processed foods. And I would say in 2020, having a diet completely free of refined and processed foods is extremely difficult to achieve. But any care you could take to reducing your intake in refined and processed foods will likely yield some sort of benefit in this context. Now, these terms refined and processed can be a little bit misunderstood, and understandably so. The best general advice I would give is your food should be as close to its original state as is realistically feasible. So that's why eating an apple tends to be healthier than drinking apple juice, or eating an orange is healthier than orange juice. That's why a piece of chicken breast tends to be healthier than a chicken sausage. The more, this isn't a universal rule, but as a general idea, the more steps of processing the food has to undergo, likely the less healthy it becomes. And particularly in this context, treatment of depressive symptoms, the more processed it is, likely the worse it is for you. And then for bonus points, the diet should be low in sugar. Now, I often find myself having to reiterate this. When I say sugar, I'm not talking about the natural sugars that occur in things like fruits and vegetables, or even dairy products. I'm talking about extrinsic sugars, added sugars, refined sugars. The lower your diet can be in those, likely the more benefit you'll see in this context. And then finally, and quite importantly, the diet should be high in healthy fats, what we call healthy fats. Now, particularly olive oil in this context, extra virgin olive oil if you can, and then also things like fish and avocado. So if you follow those 3 points, and I guess we could call it 5 points, these are the common threads that you tend to see through all of these dietary patterns that have been studied to be shown to have efficacy in this context. So that's it, sort of distilled there. So as you can see, the advice I give isn't particularly complicated, and it's actually, apart from the addition of olive oil, perhaps, it really is dietary advice that's kind of just good dietary advice, a good approach to healthy eating. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, this is why I find people often are quite reluctant to accept the efficacy of this. And I just want to highlight again, we're programmed to want an answer in pill form. What's the pill I can take? What's the supplement I can take? There's a lot of money to be made in that context. Whereas, telling people to eat some fish and olive oil, there's less money to be made there. So I think that's why a lot of people often find reluctant to accept this, because it seems a little bit too easy. But once again, it is a useful tool to add to your ongoing health care, or your ongoing mental health care. And a healthful diet will lead to good physical health which will likely, according to the best research we have, support your mental health, and in particularly in the treatment or reduction in depressive symptoms. Why? Why does this dietary pattern tend to work, or what are the possible mechanisms for it working? The truth is, we're not sure, and I try my best not to say anything with certainty that the research doesn't support, and which is why I describe it as an inexact but undeniable link. We know there's a link, we're not exactly sure what the mechanism is. However, it has been strongly hypothesized, and there is some evidence, quite compelling, to suggest that the dietary patterns may be effective because of their anti-inflammatory properties. And we know that studies have singled out low-grade chronic inflammation, which is modifiable through dietary intervention, as an important risk factor for depression. Now, I won't give a sort of science lecture in what inflammation is, but if you cut your shoulder, I don't know why you cut your shoulder, but that's the body part I was looking at. The healing process requires a certain amount of inflammation in that area, localized acute inflammation. Now, this is good. This is a completely normal physiological process. However, this idea of low-grade chronic inflammation is a type of inflammation that is constantly present in the body at a low level at all times. Now, this can have a significant effect on your overall health. And we know that there's a relationship between that idea of low-grade chronic inflammation and depression. And in fact, depressives generally display higher markers of inflammation than non-depressives. And in some cases, inflammation can actually predict the intensity of depressive symptoms. So it seems from the research, we can't say with absolute certainty, but anything you can do to reduce that level of low-grade chronic inflammation will likely yield benefit in terms of the treatment of depressive symptoms. And of course, this thing is modifiable through dietary interventions. So if you follow those tips I gave you in a couple of slides ago, it will likely have an impact in this context. Now, it must be noted that it is unlikely depression is solely an inflammatory condition. Like I said earlier, depression is a complex, multifaceted issue with a variety of interconnected reasons causing it. But we do know that inflammation can play a major role in the disease. So that's a possible mechanism why a dietary intervention might work. I've missed a slide. Associated illnesses may be another mechanism. We know that healthy dietary habits may also reduce risk of depression indirectly by potentially reducing associated illnesses, things like obesity, cardiovascular disease, and maybe diabetes. We know that there are direct links between at least these first two and rates of depression, potentially diabetes also, but that's still a little bit uncertain. Now, it is unclear whether or not these diseases increase the risk of depression or vice versa. So we know that on one hand, increased obesity rates tend to be associated with increased rates of depression. But we also know, on the flip side, increased rates of depression tend to cause an increase in obesity as well. So it's unclear whether or not these diseases increase risk of depression or vice versa, as the association is seen in both directions. So it's likely that there's a sort of bi-directional relationship between depression and these associated illnesses. So in to put this all into the context of why I'm giving this talk for Collective Creative Initiative and to a bunch of people in the creative industries, you may have seen memes like this floating around your social media, or memes about drinking quarantinis at 2 p.m. or whatever. Now, of course, I get it. Memes are funny. They help us bond, particularly in a difficult time. But I would sort of question how helpful these messages are overall in a period of time when a lot of us are likely to be, our mental health is likely to be suffering, particularly in the context of all the information I just gave you. So in a holistic sense, I would encourage you to look at this in a sort of more holistic, overarching way. And you should enjoy and take pleasure in the foods you love. There's no need to deny yourself. And I hope I've not said anything previous to this that makes you that suggests that I think you need to deny yourself the foods you love. But I would caution you to not forget to nourish your body and therefore care for your mental health. So there is an important balance that can be struck, whereas you're not, like I mentioned earlier, you adopt a diet that's not necessarily particularly onerous or restrictive, but it is a diet that takes into account the potential impact it can have on your mental health in a period of time when mental health is likely to be low. So really, I often talk about adjusting the dials of your diet. It doesn't need to be a whole massive overhaul. You don't have to cut out any food group or any particular food or anything like that. But a few small changes can make a really significant difference in this context. So as a general rule, just to finish, I do tend to be a bit averse to things like top 10 lists or giving specific dietary advice to a generalized population. I tend to like to speak to people about their needs and goals before I offer specific dietary advice. However, just to end, so you have something useful to take away with you today that you might even be able to implement in your dietary behavior, from today onwards. I would recommend you consume olive oil as your major dietary fat. So as much as you can, use olive oil whenever you would use any sort of dietary fat. So in your salads, you can bake with it. Obviously, it has a slight limitation in that it has a low smoke point, so it doesn't tend to be so useful for high heat frying. But there are other options there. But as often as you can, utilize olive oil as your dietary fat rather than butter or coconut oil or particularly other processed seed oils and so forth. Olive oil really it's delicious, it's cheap, and it can yield all kinds of benefit, not just to mental health, but to cardiovascular health and so forth. Secondly, consume oily fish as much as you can. I would recommend, in my experience, what most people are able to sort of implement practically tends to be 2 to 3 portions a week. So you could have smoked salmon and eggs for breakfast one morning, and then a piece of salmon or mackerel for dinner one evening. So people tend, in my experience, to be able to quite easily incorporate between 2 to 3 portions of oily fish in their diet weekly. And once again, this will likely yield substantial benefit, not just to your mental health, but to cardiovascular health, even weight loss. Things like sardines are great for practicality and cost, or mackerel or things like that. I realize to many people, oily fish isn't to their taste preference, which is, I completely understand that. But there are ways around that. A lot of people who don't like a salmon fillet will quite like smoked salmon, or will like salmon sashimi, or a fattier cut of tuna or something like that. I've not yet come across someone who I couldn't get to eat 2 to 3 portions of fish a week very happily. The third little tip I'd say is try and eat at least 1 serving of fruit or veg with each meal. Now, I realize most people are eating 3 times a day. That would only equate to 3 portions of fruit and veg a day, which of course is not really enough for optimal health and optimal treatment of depressive symptoms. But you'd be surprised how many people are eating even fewer than that when they actually look at their food diaries and actually go back. Oh, actually, I did some. Many people find they consume maybe 1 serving of vegetables today, or maybe even none. So if you at least start with that, with your breakfast, make sure you grab an apple with it. With your lunch, have a little side salad or something. Eat a carrot, and then of course with dinner. Now, ideally, I would say you'd be wanting to try and consume between 5 and 10 servings of fruit and vegetables daily for optimal health. But if you start with 1 with every meal, you'll find it's much easier to bump, so 3 in totality. You'll find it's much easier to bump it up to 4, then 5, then 6. And all of a sudden you're eating a fantastic variety of fruits and vegetables and improving your health in a fantastic way. And then finally, and what is understandably the most difficult thing to do, is to take any opportunity to reduce the consumption of processed foods. Now, like I said earlier, it will be likely impossible to completely eliminate consumption of processed foods. But in this context, I think it's much more helpful to think about it being better, not perfect. If you get down on yourself because you ate some bacon in your sandwich or something like that, it's likely not to yield much benefit. But any opportunity you can take to reduce, to avoid consumption of processed foods will likely yield substantial benefit to your overall health, and likely yield some benefit to your mental health also. So better, not perfect, is the sort of advice I generally give in that context. I realize it's quite a heavy topic. So of course, in all of your mental health care, I wish you the best. And I hope this is, some of this advice is useful to some of you in treating, in the treatment of some mental health conditions. Thank you so much for coming and listening. If anyone has any particular questions or would like to work with me and have some specific dietary advice tailored to your unique needs and goals, you can always get in touch. Probably the best way is just through my website, duncanrocknutrition.com. And I have all kinds of articles and videos with nutritional advice, including an article about the research that I've just outlined, but in far more detail, if any of you is interested in reading further into this topic. You can also find me at an Instagram account, DuncanRock_nutrition. And you can also contact me via Instagram. Also, I respond to messages there as well. Good luck, guys. I hope that was useful.